everybody. I am so glad to be talking to you guys while we're so far away. And bear with me because it's a little weird, but we'll get through it. So, most of you know I'm a worship leader, but what a lot of people don't know is my original reason I joined ministry was because I have a passion for asking questions and finding answers in God's Word, and then with people that He has placed in this world that are way wiser than I am. And so I've just been asking some questions, and God's been giving those answers, but He's also been prompting me to share these answers with you guys, the church, who are probably asking the same questions. So for the next few weeks, as long as we're in this, I'm going to try to answer some of these questions, or at least give us some places to start and think about what's going on around us. So, the first question, and what we're going to talk about today, is if God is good, then why are we suffering? So, that question has been debated for years, and there's no way we can fully answer that question right now in its entirety. That'd take us hours, possibly days. But the Bible does touch on why there's suffering in this world. So I'm going to give 3 reasons, and like I said, this will not fully answer that question, but I hope these 3 things will give you something to think about in the coming days when you're struggling with this question. So, suffering was a choice made at the beginning of humanity. People were made for relationship. That's why God made Adam, that's why He made Eve, to be in relationship with Him. And for a relationship to be authentic, then we must be able to say yes or no. And Adam and Eve chose no, which is when the fall happened. And a lot of people ask, well, why did God even make the tree if He knew that was a possibility? Well, the tree serves as the beacon for freedom. He put it there knowing that they had the freedom to choose to not be with Him anymore. And they did. And that choice is what led to their suffering. So Vince Vital, in his article, If God, Why Suffering, which I'm going to tag below, so you can definitely go check that out, because there's way more in that article than I can even talk about right now. But he says that the road to suffering started with temptation, then it was doubt, then it was disobedience, followed by shame, hiding, finger pointing, and then we come to suffering. Adam and Eve suffered because they had rejected their relationship with God. God didn't put the suffering on them because the first time they suffered wasn't from the consequences of their sin, which we see, but the first time they suffered was from shame. They experienced that almost immediately. We see that in Genesis 3. We see in verses 7 through 8, it says, "Then the eyes of both of them were opened, and they knew they were naked. So they sewed fig leaves together and made coverings for themselves. Then the man and his wife heard the sound of the Lord walking in the garden at the time of the evening breeze, and they hid from the Lord among the trees of the garden." They hid. They hid because they were already experiencing suffering. They were already experiencing shame. God hadn't even come into the picture yet. Shame is a natural reaction to sin, and shame is a type of suffering. So a lot of times we want to blame God for this suffering, but in reality, the absence of God itself is suffering. So we do see that there is a consequence for their sin, and that does lead to global suffering. And we're going to talk about that in a second. But what I really want to get at is that suffering, their initial suffering, did not come from God. Their initial suffering came from their decision. Number 2, suffering exists because we live in a fallen world. Going back to what we were just talking about. Adam and Eve's sin had a consequence. They knew about that consequence in the beginning. God said that if they ate from the tree of life, then there would be death, or knowledge of good and evil. And so that was laid out. They knew the consequence. But that consequence wasn't just for them. It was for us, and it was for the entire world. It was for all of creation. It's talking about nature, it's talking about people, It's talking about everything we see. And that's where we kind of get into this personal suffering versus global suffering. And that's what we're talking about here. And Paul talks about this in Romans 8. We see it in Romans 8:19 through 23. It says, "For the creation eagerly awaits with anticipation for God's sons to be revealed. For the creation was subjected to futility not willingly, but because of him who subjected it, in the hope that the creation itself will also be set free from the bondage of decay into the glorious freedom of God's children. For we know that the whole creation has been groaning together with labor pains until now. Not only that, but we ourselves who have the Spirit as the first fruits, we also groan within ourselves, eagerly waiting for adoption, the redemption of our bodies." All of creation groans, because all of creation is suffering. All of creation is experiencing decay. We don't live in a perfect world, and we know that, we say that, but we expect it to be perfect. Because when suffering appears, then something's wrong, or we blame God. But in reality, the suffering is here because of a choice made, the consequence of sin on this world, and we live in this world expecting heaven, but it's not. God's not doing it. It's what happened because of what we chose. And because of Jesus, we know that redemption is coming and redemption is possible. But right now, we do live in a world that is fallen. We do live in creation that is subjected to suffering and decay. But just because we live in that world, there are certain things that sin does not do because we have been saved through Jesus. Things that sin does not do, according to Romans 8, is sin does not condemn us. We have been freed of that by Christ. Sin does not make us slaves to sin anymore. Sin in this world does not keep us as its slaves, according to Romans 8:2. We are not doomed to death and chaos because of sin. Rather, we are given life and peace. We find that in Romans 8:6. And we are not robbed of eternity by sin. Rather, we are God's children and will enter his kingdom. And we see that in Romans 8:14 through 17. So, yes, we experience suffering here, but suffering is not the final story. Suffering is here because of a choice. Suffering is here because this is earth and not heaven, and earth is fallen. But we do not live under that. We are not cast down because of that, because we have Christ. And my third point is, suffering shows us that there is good and bad and makes us long for the good. As believers, we are not called to say that this world is good. We are not called to ignore suffering. We are not called to pretend like it doesn't exist and tell people that in the middle of their pain that it's because of sin. It's true, but that's not what we're called to do. We're called to mourn. We're called to recognize the evil that's in this world. We're called to acknowledge that bad and the evil and the sin has opposites, and that is good, love, and righteousness, and we find that through Christ. We don't deny the suffering, but we realize that it's not how God intended. Because the garden didn't start with suffering. The garden was a beautiful place. Adam and Eve were not decaying. Suffering is decay, and they were not decaying. This was not God's plan, but this is what happened because he gave us freedom. So, we look with eager expectation to restoration, because we know it's coming, and life without decay in heaven is coming, and so we hope in that, and we rest in that. And we know that exists because we know how evil suffering is. So that gives us a glimpse at how good God is, how good the opposite is going to be. We know that this world will keep us with suffering. We see that in 2 Corinthians 12:7-9 about Paul and his thorn in his side, and he prays it away, but it doesn't go away because he still lives here. Paul goes on to talk about the other believers around him in 2 Corinthians 4:8-10 and then 17-18, and he says, "We are afflicted in every way, but not crushed, We are perplexed, but not in despair. We are persecuted, but not abandoned. We are struck down, but not destroyed. We always carry the death of Jesus in our body so that the life of Jesus may also be displayed in our body. For our momentary light affliction is producing for us an absolutely incomparable eternal weight of glory. So we do not focus on what is seen, but on what is unseen. For what is seen is temporary, but what is unseen is eternal. Suffering, these people who were suffering, they didn't respond with fear. They didn't respond with calling God unfair. They didn't doubt his goodness. Those were not their reactions. Their reaction was hope for the good that was coming, for eternity. It reminded them that the opposite was coming. God's love, his sacrifice, all these things, eternity with him was coming. And they had experienced such bad suffering that they had such a good view of how good it was going to be. And that allowed it. In the light of eternity, it allowed it to be a momentary affliction. It wasn't. It wasn't a light affliction. It was far worse than anything most of us will ever experience, but in the light of eternity, they could get through it. The guy I was talking about earlier that I tagged his article, Vince Vitale, he compares this life that we're living right now to birth. And he talks about how if someone who had never seen birth and who didn't understand that birth was the beginning of life, how they would view a birth if they just walked in. Have you ever thought about it? If they just saw the birth, they would think the doctors were evil. They would think the mother was tortured, and they would think that the baby was traumatized by an unfair affliction. But if they stepped back, if they saw what happened before, they would know that the doctors had been walking this road with this mother, preparing to deliver her baby, and they would know that they had a plan, and they would know that the mother was joyful and hopeful and expectant of what was to come. And then if they zoomed out even further and they saw what happened after delivery, they would see that the doctors delivered that healthy baby, and they would see the mom grab her baby up with joy and hope, and actualized joy and hope in her hands, and they would see the baby grow and live a wonderful life, and the trauma of that moment forgotten. We don't remember that. What if this life right now is birth? What if this is the gross, ugly, painful bit that everyone tries to block out of their memory? What if right now is just a momentary affliction? It's just a moment. It doesn't mean it's less painful. It's painful. But we have a good God walking with us, who's already planned out this birth, who's already planned out our lives for us, how we're going to get through this, who's already been with earth and created earth and knows exactly how this is going to go. What if this is the necessary pain because of past sufferings, but we're about to walk into the adventure of life? Life, when viewed not as the end, but as the birth, it gives us hope and perseverance in the midst of all this suffering. So that's what I want to encourage you with today. Encourage you to remember God did not put the suffering on Adam and Eve. Adam and Eve made that choice, and sin put that suffering there. That you can't expect heaven in the midst of earth, because this isn't heaven. It's fallen, and it's messed up. And finally, that all this bad, all this evil, it's momentary. It's the birth. We're about to walk in to eternity, and it is beautiful, and it is joyful, and it is hope actualized. So, the last thing Vitale said, and what I want to leave with you with today, is that when you imagine someone great, someone who changed the world, if you strip away all their sufferings, would they still be great? For me, who comes to mind is Corrie ten Boom. If she didn't live through the Holocaust, if she wasn't in the midst of all that, we wouldn't even know who she was. She may have impacted a small piece of the world, but not like she has now. Romans 8 assures us, and we all know this, that God works everything together for the good of those who live according to his purpose. But Paul expands on that thought in Romans 5:3-4, it says, "We rejoice in our sufferings, knowing that suffering produces endurance, and endurance produces character, and character produces hope." So right now, in the midst of your suffering, what is God working for good? What character is He producing in you? What endurance is He building? What hope is He growing? Suffering exists. We see it. Let's mourn with those who suffer because it's painful. But let's not forget and not fail to see the good, the opposite of the suffering, and hold on to that hope that God is building in us, that this is the birth and we're about to step into life. So, I hope I answered some of your questions, or at least gave you something to think about in the coming days. If you have any comments, feel free to email me at centralwesleyan.ashboro@gmail.com, or you can comment. Thanks for giving me a few minutes of your day, guys, and I love you all.